Hey guys. All right, now we're going to move on to module 4, where we're going to actually start looking at some dinosaurs. And then the other half of this module is one of the subdivisions of dinosaurs called Ornithischia. But first, we need to introduce dinosaurs. So a couple of things that we're going to look at here, we're going to start figuring out anatomically, for the most part, how we classify dinosaurs and where do they fit in with all the other organisms that live on this planet. And then last, towards the very end of this one, we're going to differentiate the two major groupings of dinosaurs so that way we can follow up with our next lecture in module 4 on Ornithischia. So in this first part here, I want to ask you, which of these do you think are or are not dinosaurs? So can you identify the dinos from the dino knots? So I'll just kind of slowly start to cross off certain things that are not dinosaurs. So this one down here, this is a plesiosaur. We'll look at these a little bit later on. This one here is a mosasaur. Again, we'll look at those a little bit later on. This one here is a pterosaur, and that's just another flying reptile. It's actually not a dinosaur, though they are closely related. They're like really close cousins. And one more up here in the top right corner. This is a dinosaur toy of Dimetrodon, which is actually a predecessor of mammals. So not even related to dinosaurs at all. Beyond that, other than for, anatomical inaccuracy of these dinosaur toys, they are all dinosaurs beyond that. So how do we identify major groups? Well, let me ask you by just looking at these pictures. What do you think is the major group outlined by those on the left? You probably said dogs, and that's pretty clear, right? As we've all seen a couple dogs here and there. The one on the right, what about that? It's a little bit different because now we've got like a cartoon, perhaps a slightly bigger animal, but altogether we can just classify that as cats, right? So dogs on the left and cats on the right. So how did you figure that out? Well, I bet one of the things you were looking at was some of the similarities that they have based on maybe their nose, their structure, their ears, just kind of the facial complexion that they have. Well, that's the anatomy that's underneath of the bone structure, all the different tissues, the coloration patterns. That's anatomy, right? And so we're going to use those various different types of characteristics to help us identify between the two. To identify groups, and then within each group, different types of groupings or species. So this is where we have to come to the discussion of what is a synapomorphy. And a synapomorphy is defined as a common trait that is present in an ancestral species, so something that's much older, and is shared exclusively by all of its descendants. So for instance, all of my kids, let's say, share some kind of a freckle on their wrist that I have, right? So all of them share that. So if they were to have kids, the likelihood of that freckle passing on would be pretty likely, so that it would constantly be going to all the descendants. That would be a synapomorphy to identify the Voshik family from, let's say, the Smiths or the Joneses. So a synapomorphy can be very vague, not vague, can be very broad, or it could be very specific as well too. So it all depends on the type of classification that we're using and what type of characteristic we're trying to describe. But overall, this can be sort of tricky when we use it on extinct taxa. The reason for that is because we're extinct, we're functioning under extinct forensics, right? The acronym that I gave for paleontology. And what that results in is we don't always have all of the pieces to the puzzle. So this is what we kind of call taphonomic loss. We'll look at a whole lecture on taphonomy later on, but in short, this is the process of burial of the organism, of death and burial. And so when that occurs, sometimes an animal might come around and scavenge on some of the parts of the body, so some of the bones might be gone. Sometimes they might just be destroyed and wither away over time. And so we'll lose some of that information, some of that good data. So therefore, we might not have the entire puzzle We just might have only a few of the pieces, and we have to try to piece it back together as best as we can. So where do dinosaurs fit in terms of the family trees of all organisms, right? Well, I'm not going to get into all the specifics here of the various different terms towards the top here. You might have be familiar with some of them. Some of them might be a little bit more specific. If you ever take another biology course or look at something more like I offer a course called Comparative Anatomy, where it's an upper level biology course where we look at it and we dissect all slew of different types of animals with backbones. And we compare their morphologies to another one and other things. It's a very intensive course, but students really enjoy it because we do a lot of comparison of anatomy, right? So it's a really good course for an anatomist, particularly for those of you interested in vet school. But in short here, if we were to start off with the idea of the domain, well, we are multicellular organisms here. So we're gonna have cells composing our bodies, and then in terms of animalia, we are multicellular, where we have no cell walls, unlike plants, which do have cell walls and produce their own food. So the opposite to animalia would have been plants. Then we go into the further chordates, meaning that we have a structure called a notochord. Again, I'm not going to go into the detail here because that's a little bit beyond the scope of this course, which quickly jives right into vertebrata, which animals that have a backbone or a vertebral column. Then we go into tetrapods, which is animals with 4 limbs, no more, no less. So 4 limbs, right? And then finally, we get into something called amniota, which is those that produce amniotic eggs. So all dinosaurs are going to be producing eggs of some sort, sometimes soft shell, sometimes hard shell. Sometimes we don't know what kind of shell that they have because we haven't found them, but they're all going to be producing some sort of eggs. So therefore, where are we in terms of the first description we're going to dive into? The first thing I'm going to introduce to you guys will be diapsida. So this is where we're going to dive into the skull and what sort of holes or fenestrae the skulls may have that help us differentiate between one type of animal versus another. So these are the skull fenestrae called temporal fenestrae. That's because they're located in the temporal bone of the skull, or the temporal region of the skull, towards kind of the back part of the skull, as you can see here in some of these drawings I've got for you. So if we exclude the eye orbit, which I'm circling around here with my cursor, and so this same image kind of repeats throughout in each spot, if we look behind that, then in something like synapsids, we have 1 hole. In something called diapsids, di meaning 2, well, we have 2 holes, one on top of the other. So then how is it that we have all of these different types of fenestrations? Well, one thing that they help with is that your muscles will interweave in and out of these fenestrae to attach to different parts of the skull, to the bottom of the jaw. So therefore, some of these animals and the way that the structure of the skull and the jaw are going to be built might have a stronger bite force, weaker bite force. They might be useful for chewing versus just kind of snapping the jaw like a crocodile, or chewing like we do, or like a rabbit does. So it's going to all vary based on the skull shape and the anatomy and the needs of that animal, right? But let's look at these 4 different structures here. So the first one in the top left corner is anapsids. So the way that we've historically described evolution in terms of these skull fenestrae is that we all started off with the anapsid condition at some point way back. So that means that there was no holes. Then there was a split. So where there was a condition of 1 hole, so the synapsids, or 2 diapsids, right? And those are separated by what we call the upper and lower temporal bars, making them the upper and lower temporal fenestrae. And then at some point along the way, diapsids further evolved. So some of them stuck around in terms of this condition, but then there was a derivation where some of them evolved into urapsids, meaning they went back to this single hole condition, but only keeping that top hole of the 2. So it's different than that of the synapsids. Even though it's 1, it's a bit different because it's kind of, they lost one of the 2 while retaining the other. Now, not to kind of throw your head over, one of the things that we've started to realize now, because more data has come out and we found more fossils to help fill in the holes that we've had, no pun intended here, is that there's another hypothesis that's now out there that's roaming around that's just as good, is that the ancestral condition was actually the synapsids. So that people are thinking that we started off with just the one hole, and then it ended up resulting in, and I'm going to draw on here, a kind of a backwards evolution where we went down to no holes or up by one. So if we kind of think of this from one of the very basic lectures, or one of the first lectures that we had about the idea of parsimony, to try to come up with the simplest concept. Both of these sort of work, right? Going from no holes to one or two. Or the opposite is being that if we started with one and we reduced that down to zero, or we increased it by a count of one. So both of those actually fit with the idea of being parsimonious. But which one is the correct way? Well, that's going to be something that you might end up figuring out yourself, or we're going to have to rewrite the textbooks probably another 10 to 15 years once we find more fossils and data to help better distinguish between these two different pathways. But for now, for the rest of our course, what we're going to, for the most part, use is the design that I've shown out here with the yellow arrows, where we start off with the anapsids, evolving into synapsids, and into diapsids. So let's kind of look at diapsids first. In these different skull fenestrations in general. So anapsids, no temporal fenestra. The major type of animal that kind of has this are turtles. And we'll look at turtles here in a minute. Synapsids have one, so that's going to be all mammals, and our predecessors, so something like Dimetrodon, one of those little toys that we had on this initial slide here of this lecture. And then diapsids. So diapsids have two pairs, so two holes. In this case here, we don't necessarily see them drawn up, but this is where one would be, and then the other one would be right below here. So they're separated out by kind of this bar right here. And so animals that have this are going to be your dinosaurs, pterosaurs, other of their swimming reptiles, which eventually evolve into that urapsid condition that we saw on the previous slide, and all sorts of different other reptiles that we have around today, crocodiles, lizards, snakes, things like that. So then what's up with turtles? Where is it that they actually belong? Well, we don't really know. This is a tricky conundrum that we have in paleontology, where turtles have given us a bit of a run for our money to try to figure out where they land in the evolutionary tree of life. Some individuals think that they land closer to things like mosasaurs and snakes because of their anapsid condition. Sometimes they might think that they might go somewhere along as a distant cousin to archosaurs, which combine crocodiles, dinosaurs, and pterosaurs. They might even think that they are completely out there as like these weird animals that we just don't even know where to put them, along with ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, so these like swimming marine reptiles. But overall, we're starting to get a little bit of an idea of where they might fall, and it's likely that they fall completely outside of diapsids into their own grouping of anapsids, somewhere in between synapsids and this whole grouping of diapsids. But that's more for a future discussion, maybe perhaps later on in the course if you want to have it, or something that we can have off channels through email or something if you're really curious. So continuing on with dinosaurs here, we're going into our next division of Archosauria. So let's look at how that demonstrates it. So we're getting smaller and smaller until we finally get down into dinosaurs. So for archosaurs, here we're still looking at crocodiles, perhaps various different kind of other lizards and things like that. We have a few characteristics. We have another fenestra that's added in, and this is called an antorbital fenestra. Ant meaning anterior to the orbit. So the orbit would be here. This is where the eye would be. And this is anterior to the orbit, so antorbital. So this is another hole that's there in the skull. They will also have a lateral mandibular fenestra. And so if we look at the lower jaw, there's another hole there. And all of these holes are going to be for muscle attachment, nerves, different other components that are going to help with various different aspects like bite force and chewing and things like that. Then if we look at the teeth, they have a condition called thecodont. And so this means that they have their teeth actually set within the sockets of their jaws. And what this does is that it really significantly reduces the possibility of those teeth being ripped out during a feeding time frame. So we don't really want those teeth being constantly ripped out. They will be reducing and not reducing, but shedding these teeth as they go. But we don't want them to be shed within 1 or 2 days. It's going to take a couple months for that to usually happen. And then lastly, the other major characteristic is that they have what's called a fourth trochanter on their femur, which is your thigh bone. So that I've got highlighted here in a yellow circle. So there's this raised ridge. And ultimately what this does, again, is provide lots of muscle attachment sites for your muscles so they can move around, and starts to lead into more of an upright stance. More on that in a minute. So our next division is Ava metatarsalia. And if you remember from when we talked about our bones, and you had to study the bones for the last exam, metatarsals are those of your feet. So the kind of longer bones think about it as like the palm of your foot, right? So the different angle and the way that these are shaped and oriented is what's going to define the major split in this group. So let's look at that. So in Ava metatarsalia, or Archosauria is split into two groups. We have what it's called pseudosuchia. So this translates into fake crocodiles, but we know that they're not necessarily fake. It's just the way that we have to sometimes name things in here, because some of these in this group are not necessarily crocodiles, but it's a more inclusive term that we've named that group. And then the other side is Ava metatarsalia. So what is the difference between these two? Well, let's look at this image here on the top right. So pseudosuchia, that crocodiles belong to. If we were to look at their kind of the wrist version, or their ankles, they have this kind of zigzag pattern in the way that some of these tarsals are built. Whereas in Ava metatarsalia, that which is that of all the dinosaurs, including pterosaurs as well too, which are not dinosaurs, and kind of related cousins to dinosaurs, we can draw a diagonal line right across, which will allow ultimately for more of a single hinge. So therefore, if you look at my screen here, or where I am, the animal can kind of move their hand like this, right? In this case, we're talking about the ankles. So what this starts to lead to is more and more transition into an upright stance, with the possibility of then moving a little bit faster. So then finally, we get into Dinosauria. So let's look at how dinosaurs then are defined based on their anatomy from other animals that aren't dinosaurs. So if we go back to that fourth trochanter on the femur, unlike previously, dinosaurs modify this and take it to the next step. So what they do is they make it asymmetrical. So in image B here, where my cursor is, this is a more symmetrical trochanter, that of what you would see in a crocodile. In C is kind of the zoomed in image of A. This is what we would have in a dinosaur, where the kind of the ridge comes up here pretty quickly, and then there's a more gradual slope going down closer to the proximal end of the bone here. So it's asymmetrical. So what does this do? It helps the animals go furthermore into this upright stance, where the legs and the appendages are directly under the core of the body. Unlike a crocodile, which is sort of in a continuous push-up like position. So therefore it has its arms just kind of sprawling out and its limbs sprawling outwards. The other major characteristic here of the bones that we see as part of the appendicular skeleton is that they, on the humerus, so your top kind of arm bone, is going to have a very large ridge called the deltopectoral crest. And so if we look at this image here on the right, we've got a duckbill dinosaur here. Here is our scapula. This is the humerus here, radius ulna, and then getting into the metacarpals and so on and so forth. But in this bone here, the humerus, this big ridge, then zoomed in, so this big ridge right here where my cursor is, that's what we call the deltopectoral crest. And that will, again, allow for lots more muscle attachment sites and actually extend the length of the forelimb. So therefore, now the animal has a bit more power, so they can use their forelimbs to move around, to manipulate things, whatever it is that they might do. Other areas of the body also vary. So if we look at their hip bones are quite a bit different. They will have what's called a perforated, so there's a hole, a complete hole that goes all the way through of the acetabulum. And so the acetabulum is the part where it's the plug-in part where your femur would join in to make that hip, that kind of ball and socket joint that we have. So that ball and socket joint continues throughout most land animals. But what we end up seeing in dinosaurs is that there is a complete hole. So here I have an example of a deer and a turkey, so a mammal and a dinosaur. A turkey is a bird, which is a dinosaur. So in a deer, this right here is the acetabulum. This is where the ball joint of the femur would go into. There's no hole. But in this case here, there is. So it's a complete perforated hole there, and that's one of those major characteristics. So using this and then expanding out on the shape of the hip bones, we have two orientations that will then split into the two different groupings of dinosaurs. The ornithischians, which are named as bird-hipped, are going to contain all of our duck-billed dinosaurs, our horned dinosaurs, the ceratopsians, our dome-headed dinosaurs, and things like the ankylosaurs and stegosaurs. And so if you look on the image here on the right, if you can look past kind of the bones here, what we've got is the ilium is still going to sit in that same condition between ornithischia and saurischia. It might be a bit more expanded out depending on the animal that it is. But what we're going to be looking at is the difference between the pubis and the ischium and the orientation. So the ischium is still going to kind of point towards the back half of the animal, just like it does in saurischia. So the difference is then the pubis. So in ornithischians, the pubis sits and hugs along the ischium and is running more or less parallel with it. Whereas in saurischians, we have it that it goes more anteriorly, forming almost like a hatchet on the very end of it as well too. So ornithischians are nicknamed as bird-hipped, whereas saurischians are nicknamed as lizard-hipped. But, as you probably noticed, why is it that birds are under saurischians, which are lizard-hipped, and not bird-hipped ones? Well, this is where, historically, we've had to change because we figured out a little bit more data, but we already named these groups over time. So rather than having to go back historically into all of the books and all the papers and changing everything, we've kept the same nomenclature, just understanding that birds actually evolved from saurischians. So kind of the carnivorous, more meat-eating type of dinosaurs, though not all of them were meat-eating. So to help summarize this idea here, we've got Dinosauria, and we've got two major splits. We've got the ornithischians here on the left, and we've got our saurischians here on the right, which is where birds eventually evolved from. So this major division is all in the hips. So it's based on the location and orientation of the pubis bone, which is one of the three bones that make up the hip. So in ornithischians, the pubis will run posteriorly parallel with the ischium, whereas in saurischians, it starts to run anteriorly opposite in kind of the direction of that the ischium is going. All right, so that ends this lecture. The next one will be on the ornithischian dinosaurs, my favorite.